Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Modernize User Experience, hosted by Tandem 7, featuring new research and insights from our presenter, Leah Bewley, Principal Analyst with Forrester Research. At the conclusion of our presentation, we'll be opening up for a few minutes of Q&A. Please submit your questions in the questions panel, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end, but if not, we'll follow up with you individually following the event. Also, we will be sending you a copy of Leah's latest Forrester Research report, How to Modernize User Experience, Compliments of Tandem 7, following the event. And with that, I believe we're ready to begin. Over to you, Leah.
Thanks, Allison. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm excited to have you on the line today for this webinar, and I'm really excited to share some of the research that I've been doing. So to kick things off, let me start by introducing myself. My name's Leah Bewley. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester, which is a firm that does research and analysis on the business and technology industries. And at Forrester, I'm on a team that focuses on customer experience as a sort of broad category. Within the topic of customer experience, my beat, if you will, is user experience. And that's because prior to Forrester, I spent over 15 years in the UX field as a practitioner. So the research that I'm doing at Forrester is really geared towards addressing kind of one core question, which is how can companies best leverage the strategic asset that is user experience? And that's what I'm really excited to talk about with you today in this webinar. So let's dig right in. We're going to start by looking at the state of the UX industry at a very high level. And then we're going to move on to looking at the different ways that UX is actually taking shape inside of companies. And we'll look at a couple different models for what types of UX organizations I have found in my research. We will then move from there to talking about something that I'm actually really interested in. I think it gets overlooked a lot, but it's pretty important. And that's the tools that kind of more modern UX organizations are employing to support their work. We'll spend a little time there, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So be taking notes on your questions throughout, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. So let's start by talking about the state of user experience. So the UX field is not what it once was, it turns out. It's a field that has changed and evolved quite a bit in the sort of 30-odd years since it was born. And we can kind of go on a quick journey of the value migration of UX just to kind of level set our understanding here. So in the beginning, starting in really the late 70s and the early 80s, when computers first began to be really commercially available in wide distribution, there was this field called human-computer interaction or man-machine systems. And the concept here was really how can you make kind of core workflows usable for many cases, expert-trained users. This gave rise to a whole series of practices that we kind of think of today as usability. And the goal of usability is to understand how you can help a user accomplish a task without creating accidental errors or without getting stopped in their task. And so usability was an important development for really early days, kind of complicated software products like DBase and FoxPro and WordPerfect, things that people could get a lot of training on but still potentially experience errors with just by sheer virtue of being such complex software to work with. So those are kind of the progenitors of what we think of as early days user experience. But then along comes the personal computer and, more importantly, the web, and sort of changes our ideas about what is necessary from a usability perspective. Between personal computing and the web, a new breed of computer user started to emerge, essentially. And this was somebody who was not necessarily trained, not an expert, not necessarily professional. Could be somebody who's pretty unsavvy from a kind of computer perspective, but who we nevertheless want to be able to accomplish certain tasks. And for the UX field, this really changed the nature of the challenge for people who were interested in human-computer interaction. They've started to focus more on the concepts of web design, information architecture, and we started to see some of the language of user experience beginning to emerge. And in this time, the practice itself started to evolve from something that was about kind of usability of core workflows into something that was more about trying to enable people to kind of find their way onto paths that were desirable for the business and in a way optional for users to participate in. This made it more important to think about how you design navigation structures so people can get the right sense of whether they're on to the information they're looking for, how you design workflows that are not compulsory but that are desirable. So this gave rise to a lot of tools like sort of funnel analysis. And it also gave rise to tools that are very core to the UX field today, like personas and scenarios, which help you better understand a user, their needs, and the behaviors that we expect them to exhibit. But it doesn't stop there, of course. Today is a different world, and we have mobile to thank for that. So now the UX field has new skills, not only specific mobile design skills, but also mobile is challenging the user experience field to think more holistically about user journeys, and that concept that there's a kind of experience that crosses multiple touch points that sort of exists somewhere in the ether between this device and that device, and where the experience nevertheless needs to sort of persist and make sense over space and time. And we also have the challenge of actually designing user experiences that may not even be within a kind of owned product or service domain anymore. Now we have mashups of services and mashups of products that exist in new service layers from third parties, and all of this is the messy complexity that UX professionals are kind of wading into these days. And the result of that is it's caused UX to get both more macro and more micro. At the macro level, the UX field now brings in inspiration from the service design field to think about higher level customer journeys. And we also bring in a lot of inspiration to think about sort of smaller moments in design that nevertheless lead to an overall harmonious experience. So Dan Saffer's book, Micro Interactions, Android's new material design language, the growing importance of fields like content strategy and responsive web, they all train the attention of the user experience professional on getting the details right, but then at the same time, we have to think about how to think holistically across these kind of customer journeys. So it's a complicated and interesting domain for user experience professionals today. And that's not even the end of the story, because in some places, experience design is now moving into a focus that's core to the business. And this is happening for several reasons. One reason is that consumers are more empowered than ever before because of technology. They have better access to competitive information, they have fewer switching costs, they have more choice than ever before. So consumers and customers have the luxury of being perhaps a little more fickle and choosy than we have historically in the past, which requires companies to be a little more on their game with respect to creating great customer experiences. And in parallel with that, the technical barriers to entry for competition in business is lowering. The full stack itself has become this service, so people can spin up new startups and new businesses to challenge incumbents pretty quickly. And all of this is turning design itself into this untapped area of competitive advantage, because great design is showing that it can lead to greater adoption and greater loyalty. And loyalty in large numbers is leading to a different kind of value for organizations, where the users themselves become not just the people who bring the money in terms of purchases, but generators of their own value through the assets they provide. So they bring user-generated content, and they bring more users through sort of network effects. And the ultimate effect of that is that there are these sort of value networks that are differentiated simply because there's a desire for many users to be a part of them. So Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, these are all scenarios where great user experience ultimately leads to a network of users with a size and a reach to potentially unseat established markets in a way we have not seen ever before. So it's really crazy and it's exciting. And as a result, I think people are investing in user experience in ways they have not previously. So in Silicon Valley, near where I live, venture capital firms are now bringing on design partners to help essentially coach their portfolio companies about how to make design more core to their organizations. And for more on that trend, there's a really great presentation from John Maeda, who's a design partner at Kleiner Perkins here in Northern California, and he gave a great talk at South by Southwest a couple weeks ago on that. So look online for more information about that. So that is a high-level overview of the fact that the user experience field has come very far in 30 years, and that journey that it's been on has in some ways sort of tracked the evolution of the role of software and digital in business and in society. So the interesting thing, though, is that not every organization holds this modern view of what your user experience is and is capable of. So even though many companies are actually investing in user experience, they're hiring headcount, it's not necessarily the case that just having UX people on staff is leading to the kind of changes and the kind of value that we saw on the previous slide. It turns out there are really actually pretty significant variations in how UX is practiced inside companies, and I want to share some research that I conducted to kind of illustrate that a little further. So late last year, I conducted a survey of customer experience and user experience professionals, and the goal of this was really to understand how UX is being practiced inside of organizations. It went out to both UX and CX professionals. We had 112 respondents in the end, which is kind of a small but sort of large enough sample to help you kind of start to extrapolate trends across the industry. We fielded it for about 6 weeks, and respondents ranged all the way from individual contributors up to VPs of design in their organizations. In this survey, we asked questions ranging from, what's the size of your team? How big is your organization? What types of projects does user experience work on? What types of activities are part of the UX process? What level of impact is UX seeing? And what are some barriers? And one of the questions that we asked was to try to understand at a really base level, what is the level of strategic impact that respondents feel UX is having in their firms? And so we asked this question on a 5-point scale, which is sort of what's represented in this bar that you see on screen. There were about 32% of respondents who answered in the top 2 boxes of the 5-point scale. So they are what I would call kind of high-impact UX teams. They're saying that their organization on a scale of 1 to 5 is able to have a 5 or a 4 in terms of strategic impact for UX. Another 33% are in that middle box, and then 35% in that sort of bottom 2 box, which I'm calling low-impact UX. So kind of a classic bell curve. But from here, then, the next question that I wanted to ask was, what are the differences between the work that those high, medium, and low impact teams are doing and the kind of impact they're able to see? And so we ended up cutting that impact question that you just saw on the previous slide against another question that focused more specifically on products. And so the question was, what types of products does your UX team work on? And what we saw was that most UX teams, whether they're high or low impact, work on web and mobile. And that's really significant numbers there, 94%, 94, 87. There's also a sizable number who work on desktop and employee tools, and it's fewer than web and mobile, but it's still pretty significant. And what's also significant, I think, about these numbers is that there's not really a huge difference between what the high impact and the low impact respondents are doing. So there's not a strong variation in behavior in these particular categories. Now here's where there is some difference, some variation in behavior. There was a much greater disparity between the work being done in what I would call non-digital categories for these survey respondents. Physical experiences, services, customer support, and even print collateral. It's not that all high-impact teams are doing this kind of work, but the high-impact teams are significantly more likely than low-impact teams to be doing this kind of work. And this implies, for me, that the firms with high impact UX are more comfortable putting UX in a position to think more holistically across experiences that span multiple channels and multiple touch points, which is, in a way, if we go back to the kind of value migration of UX, that's sort of the difference between the transactional UX approach and the ubiquitous UX approach. Or, to really oversimplify things, it's like the difference between 90s UX and sort of 2000s UX. So that's an interesting sort of signal about one kind of important difference between the high impact and low impact teams. And when you marry that with the next data point, I think a really interesting picture starts to emerge. So we also cut the impact question against one about UX activities. the question is, what is the UX group's role in the following activities? And here again, we found that there are some things that UX professionals are just likely to do, regardless of whether they're high impact or low impact or somewhere in the middle. They do design in a digital channel, and they do some form of validation, kind of usability testing oriented validation. So the big difference here, though, is that there are some activities that high-impact teams are significantly more likely to do than low-impact UX teams. And it's everything you see here on screen. They're more likely to do experience strategy, project scoping, roadmap planning, user research, and as we saw, I think in the previous slide, non-digital design. And so those numbers are pretty shocking. I mean, that sort of almost 100% of high impact teams are doing experience strategy or scoping and planning, but that fewer than half in some of those cases are on the low impact teams suggests a pretty big difference in behavior. And what's important about this is that the stuff that everybody's doing, of course, it's depicted here in this slide like it comes first because of the way the number is shaked out, but it doesn't come first. There are activities from a process perspective that actually come last. They are the result of specific analysis and planning efforts, research, strategy, and assessment of the holistic experience. All those things shape ultimately what a firm decides to design and what that firm then defines as usable from a testing perspective. So really, I think it's important to look at the data this way, which is that one of the big differences between high impact and low impact teams is that UX has a more active role in the upfront process that ultimately shape what gets designed and how success is measured. So for those firms, that means UX style research plays a larger role in shaping products. It also means that strategy is more likely to include sort of the UX version of strategy, which is heavily focused on vision and creating a sort of picture of what the ideal experience will look like, rather than maybe planning and prioritization, which is a bigger emphasis in sort of some of the more business-friendly kind of definitions of strategy. It also means that in the course of planning and scoping work, UX is able to help represent the voice of the user. And an interesting side benefit as well in some of the research that I saw is it means that UX can play a facilitative role to help the organization through the strategy planning and sort of research process to actually get that information kind of consumed among cross-functional colleagues in more of a facilitative way, where they're doing workshops or they're putting up personas on the wall, and all of this stuff becomes fodder for discussion across the varied roles. As one example of this, there's a team at Informatica that has created what they call the Jumpstart Workshop, which is a kind of 3-day intensive where they bring in cross-functional colleagues to really kind of assimilate all the research information they have and sort of scope out what they think the strategy is for the next kind of installment of improvements to the product. And UX plays a really strong facilitative role in that kind of work. And we see that sort of example in a lot of the high-impact UX teams. So in the end, firms with high-impact UX also end up being more successful at connecting their impact to measurable benefits to the business. And they do that in obvious categories where you would expect UX to actually be able to drive some numbers like behavior metrics, but they also do it in categories that are very important from a customer experience perspective, like customer satisfaction, sentiment, lifetime value, and they're even more successful at demonstrating a relationship between UX and that all-important category of revenue. Curiously, low-impact teams don't do as much in those areas, but they do more to demonstrate cost reduction, which is significant because I think it connects more to the early idea of UX as usability or UX as efficiency, UX as error prevention, but it has less of that idea of UX as amplifier of value that we see in the transformative UX approach from our early slides. So based on this data and the qualitative interviews that I conducted as well in this research, it began to be clear to me that there are a few different styles of UX teams. And the differences among those teams hinge on a few key qualities that are sort of represented here. Scope, which is sort of the level of the overall customer experience that the user experience gets involved in, strategy, the extent of upfront kind of organization and planning around what that experience is going to be, research, how much customer research actually feeds into the process, the design process itself, the actual capacity and staffing of the UX team, and the tools that those teams employ to help get their work done. And so kind of on a spectrum of least mature to most mature, what I ended up seeing was that there are some organizations that have what I would call an outdated user experience model, where UX is still very much operationally and kind of in terms of the value it provides in the old model of kind of usability UX. In those firms, the scope for UX work is very ad hoc because there isn't necessarily sort of a dedicated kind of remit for UX. What ends up happening instead is projects come to UX as it's assessed that there's some need for kind of testing or validation or kind of spot design improvements. And it tends to be pretty much digital only in terms of how it gets defined. Strategy is mostly absent because it's being done by some other teams earlier in the process. Research, to the extent that it exists, is very focused on that kind of evaluative research that happens in usability testing. Design, the design process itself, it's a lot more about kind of the wireframes that connect into the process documentation, that connect into something you can hand over to developers to implement. And staffing models in these organizations often look like generalists sort of peppered throughout the business. Even for firms that actually have a lot of UX professionals on staff, it can still be possible for them to have this model when they essentially have kind of lone gun UX professionals, UX sort of generalists distributed in different parts of the business, covering a big number of product managers and product development teams. And then these teams are using really basic design tools, essentially the tools to help them kind of mock up wireframes and in some cases do usability testing. But there is a more kind of forward-looking model that I saw in a lot of firms that I talked to, and I'd say this is becoming much more dominant in industry, which I call the progressing model. So here, what you see is that UX teams start to have greater responsibility for multiple digital touch points. So not just the website, but also the mobile app, but also the tablet experience. In some cases, even IVR or things like that. The interactive voice response system. In terms of strategy and the way that these UX teams get involved in strategy, it's still not like big McKinsey-style strategy with a capital S, but they do have a more active role in the process of understanding business requirements and how they should shape the ultimate design solution. And they partner that with more ethnographic or generative style research activities, which start to become more prevalent in organizations who are in this progressing model. So they still do use iterative testing, but there's also kind of an upfront research process to understand customer needs and to use those to shape the ultimate requirements for design. In this progressing model, it's also a lot more common to start to see teams who have a design process that can be characterized as iterative and that can be characterized as moving from low fidelity to high fidelity along a spectrum of sort of iteration and validation. So starting with, sort of back in the napkin sketches, doing kind of paper prototype-based kind of testing, and then moving into higher fidelity design. Again, because these teams tend to get more involved in kind of requirements gathering, they tend to maybe do more of a kind of facilitative workshop style approach in the way that they work with their cross-functional colleagues. They then may also find themselves facilitating the design process as a kind of open design studio kind of model where they're bringing in cross-functional colleagues. Here in this progressing model, we start to see embedded throughout the organization more robust user experience teams that don't just have sort of the one generalist, but they start to have careful consideration of a wide breadth of skills that are necessary for user experience work. So researchers who are capable of doing that generative and evaluative design that I mentioned. Interaction designers, visual designers, prototypers, and increasingly content strategists, copywriters, maybe even design prototypers I mentioned, but animators, things like that. So really kind of bringing a fully staffed team close into the business units where they're able to deliver on design. And the tools that they start to use are really geared towards that facilitative kind of iterative design approach. So a lot of rapid prototyping and testing tools. And because they're working in close partnership, often or closer partnership with the development teams that they support, a lot of emphasis on how to integrate into the Agile process in many organizations. But that's, of course, just a kind of an interim stage. The modern UX organization, which I'm seeing more and more examples of. It's definitely not what I would say the vast majority in industry, but I'm surprising I'm constantly surprised by more organizations that I'm finding who really fit this mode. And for them, what you have is a scope that is not just digital, it's end-to-end, and it's intentionally and by design, both sort of horizontal and vertical. There's some capacity for thinking about how the overall customer experience will unfold from one touch point to another, how it will unfold over time, and how kind of not just the first experience, but repeat experiences and deeper engagement will sort of evolve for the user. And then it's vertical in the sense that there's expert design skills for designing at the specific channels and touch points that are necessary. So great mobile designers on staff and great web designers and even people who are expert in service design and other forms of design on staff. Strategy here is something that these teams get actively involved in. They play if not a leadership role, at least a co-lead role in setting a vision for what the ideal customer experience is going to look like, and they are active participants in the shaping of the firm's roadmap to actually deliver that vision in a way that aligns with firm strategies. Their research process, of course, has the iterative testing approach and it has the ethnographic research approach, but with the modern teams what we see is they start to get a little bit more sophisticated about how to blend kind of UX style research, which often is kind of qualitative in nature, with more quantitative research coming out of kind of data analytics teams or market research teams, and they work with those colleagues in a really confederated way to bring a more robust set of customer insights into the design process and to drive design as a kind of constant loop of experiments to kind of further and further kind of improve the experience. These user experience teams are more likely to govern or at least contribute to experience standards. Often they're creating design principles that are channel agnostic, that kind of articulate what the experience of this brand should feel like, whether it's a call center experience or whether it's a web experience. And then they're doing additional work to interpret then what those principles mean at a click down at the level of a specific channel. These teams often will also actually be responsible for guidelines and patterns and design language systems, and they may have dedicated resources who really manage those kind of tools for the overall design community within their organization. They obviously have kind of more robust teams, as you see in the progressing model, but the key difference here is they have really strong leadership too. It's in really, I think without exception, where you find a modern UX organization, you find a really strong like VP level design leader who has the ear of peers and colleagues, at that level in their organization, and has really direct access and good rapport with the C-suite and with, executive level leaders. And that enables them to not just be a service to the organization, but also to set standards for what quality experiences look like and be a kind of corrective force on parts of the organization that may not be delivering at quality. And then from these modern teams, the tools they use start to blend more into the kind of a higher level concept of customer experience. So they definitely have tools that start to kind of bring in that qualitative understanding of the customer that I mentioned a moment ago. They are much more likely to either champion or be active participants in journey mapping efforts, which are a really critical tool for the customer experience community to actually understand the high level end-to-end customer journey, but also to communicate the concept of that across the organization. And these teams, because they end up getting, in some cases, involved in a kind of, think of it as like a hub and spoke model where there's some central capabilities for experience standards, and then there are maybe more embedded teams within the business units, the need for enterprise-wide knowledge sharing becomes paramount. So moving information both across the UX community within the organization, but then also outside of the UX community so that it can be used by colleagues in product management or development or marketing or other parts of the organization that are impacted. So when I mention the modern UX organization, I'm really talking about this group here on the right-hand side. And I think it's really interesting to start to, well, first of all, ask what version you have in your organization. And as I find myself talking to different companies now that I'm at Forrester, it's, for me, very helpful to just start by understanding, okay, what's your understanding of user experience? Are we still working with basic assumptions that UX is just usability, and is there kind of core education needed in that area? Or are you what you're really trying to accomplish, something more like building up at scale, as a modern UX organization might be trying to do? So for the purposes of this webinar, I actually want to spend a little time digging into this category of tools, because I think tools themselves can be a really great amplifier of all of the categories that I mentioned above. Tools can help teams get a handle on that end-to-end scope. They can help teams connect the dots between research and strategy and design decisions. They can help teams foster really a particular type of design process, and they can even help a large and distributed team work more effectively together. So I'm going to turn my attention now to the tools that modern UX organizations use. And I'm going to start it off by risking it all and abusing a really already well-worn metaphor and talk about the modern UX toolkit. So in the UX community, there's a lot of talk about the methods of UX as the toolkit. And that's certainly true. But there's also actually a really tangible way of thinking about the tools of the UX toolkit, which is what are the software and the products that a UX team should allocate budget for to help them do their work. In my research, what I saw and heard modern UX teams doing was talking about a lot of different tools and products that help them amplify their work, help them move faster, help them be more successful at spreading this information around their organization. So I'm going to share 6 different types of tools. The first category is research tools. And I guess it stands to reason that if modern UX teams are more likely to actually do rigorous user research, they're also more likely to need user research tools. Of course, the UX field has this reputation for being very analog when it comes to research and data analysis, so lots of Moleskine notebooks and Post-it notes and Sharpies. But modern UX organizations put more thought into the collection of user data and the atomization of user data, essentially how you pull out the insights from that data. And that's a challenge because the type of qualitative research that's very common to UX, it produces very unstructured data. But teams who produce this kind of data, who do this kind of research in really high volume and need to analyze it in high volumes, end up discovering that organizing it and sharing it with their organization warrants the need for digital tools to support that process. So some examples of the types of tools that modern UX teams use in this area, and these are just representative. There are definitely a lot more in this category and in all the categories that I'll share, but just to kind of illustrate the nature of the types of tools that these teams are using. We found some research teams using tools like Ethos. Ethos stands for Ethnographic Observation System. The idea of Ethos is that it enables participants to kind of collect their own data in a way in the context of a study using their mobile devices. So like think of a diary study on your mobile phone that can come in a lot of different, you can take a picture, you can record, record an audio snippet, you can enter a text, and then all that data essentially gets fed to the research team into a tool that lets them see and analyze that data in a structured way. So Ethos is one example. UX 360 is another example of that kind of tool that helps you centralize the storage and the sharing of granular research data. It also, in the case of UX 360, it enables teams to store that detailed research data and then connect it to other UX artifacts like personas and journey maps. And full disclosure, UX 360 is a tool created by Tandem 7, the host of this great webinar. Another tool in this category is Revelation, Revelation Next. Revelation is actually, it's kind of like Ethos in that it's good for mobile diary studies and data collection, but it was acquired by Focus Vision in 2014, and Focus Vision has kind of a whole quantitative research platform. It has that it joins with the qualitative tools of Revelation. It has like a survey tool, it has some channel-specific research tools, and all those things become an overall kind of sharing platform. Between Ethos, UX 360, Revelation, and other tools in this category, what they have in common, most importantly, is the idea that teams should be able to gather and make sense of unstructured research data in a structured way. And then they need to be able to connect that information into other artifacts for their organization that make it shareable and actionable. So let's look next at another category of very related tools, analytics tools. So analytics, I think admittedly these aren't owned by UX, and they're, in a lot of ways, they're sort of more connected to the concept of marketing and the funnel. But what's significant about how modern UX teams kind of connect into tools like analytics tools is that they work on bringing the kind of quantitative insights that come out of analytics and marrying it with the qualitative insights from the kind of previous category of research tools that I just mentioned to create this more balanced understanding of the customer. There's one good example of this that comes from Alex Wright, who's a user research manager at Etsy, which I just learned about in this excellent podcast called Dollars to Donuts, which is hosted by Steve Portugal. He's the author of Interviewing Users, and he's basically interviewing user research managers in different organizations. And so we talked to Alex, and what Alex explained is that the Etsy team was doing some research to learn more about the Etsy seller experience. So people who sell things on Etsy. And they observed through qualitative research that sellers are using the paper printout of their confirmation screens to help manage their workflows. And then this seemed like an interesting insight, so they partnered with the data analytics team to start tracking how many times sellers were printing things, and they found that it was really sizable. And that kind of qualitative insight coupled with data that analytics was then able to provide helped them realize they needed to focus more design attention in this area of the printout. So a good example of kind of pulling on analytics data to support kind of qualitative research data. So tools like Google Analytics can help you do this, and analytics is definitely widely used in the web and mobile world, and definitely kind of a core expertise for a lot of UX practitioners. Tools like Kissmetrics also take that analytics style tracking one level deeper, and they help identify and track not just sort of visits, but individual users, and then be able to kind of connect, understand who that user specifically is and potentially reach out to them for further research, which is interesting. Another recurring theme among the modern UX teams is that they use quantitative research as a starting point for identifying key user behaviors to understand who they might want to follow up with specifically for deeper qualitative research. So tools like Kissmetrics make that possible. And then tools like Crazy Egg, ClickTails in this category, also the beefier older cousin IBM Tea-Leaf, all of these make the same kind of analytics information available, but they do it in a highly visual format that's almost takes inspiration from the old-fashioned eye tracking heat map to help understand user behavior kind of viscerally. So in some modern UX organizations, the UX team includes sort of more quantitative, sort of analytics-focused researchers who are actually excellent in these tools. But it's probably more common, I would say, to find modern UX organizations where there's a qualitative research partner who works really closely with data analytics partners to mine this data. And the key here is that just the modern UX teams know how to look for and use this data, and they know what kind of questions to ask. So they become very important tools in the modern UX toolkit. Let's move now to journey mapping. Like user research data, journey maps are another component of the UX process that lends itself to Sharpies and Post-it notes, but that doesn't make them very shareable across an organization. And the thing about journey maps, what I've been seeing in the research I've been doing at Forrester is organizations are crazy about them. They love them. They want to see and engage with journey maps. They feel like this is a tool that is understandable. It helps everybody think from that outside-in perspective and really put themselves in the minds and perspectives of the customer. It helps them think about the relationship between all these sort of back-end processes that the organization takes for granted and the eventual emotional outcome and behavioral outcome that the user has as a result. So modern UX teams, I find, get more actively involved in journey mapping processes just generally. They are more likely to participate in journey mapping workshops or maybe even lead them, and they are more likely to find ways to connect their data into that process. I've seen some organizations who I won't name, but they do journey mapping, but they don't actually do the user research to feed into the journey mapping. So instead, like stakeholders will create the journey map based on their knowledge of the customer. But I would say a more rigorous approach is to conduct the kind of UX research that modern UX teams do, and then use that to feed into journey mapping efforts. So different tools like those listed here, the Journeys app, which is created by Universal Mind. It's a tablet-based tool that supports mobile mapping, which is kind of cool because you can use it during research or you can use it during internal mapping sessions. UX 360 and Smaply are more robust journey mapping tools, I would say. They both have persona integration. And then UX 360 has kind of enterprise-wide sharing capabilities as well. What all of these tools share, I would say, is an ability to map not just what happens over time from a user's perspective, but also their emotional journey through those different touch points. And that supports the kind of holistic experience design that we see modern UX teams undertaking. So that's a kind of key component for modern UX teams. Those first three categories we've just looked at are really about research. So let's turn our attention now to making. First you learn, then you make. It's tempting to think that when it gets down to design, there's just really one way to do it, but modern UX teams, I think, are showing that there's a different way you can approach the design process. So it's not just about pushing pixels in Visio or Illustrator, but modern UX teams have that approach where they're working iteratively from early concept to detailed design. And along that journey, they're also working through successively higher degrees of fidelity, as we mentioned before. These teams are more likely to prototype in code. They're also more likely to be willing to put really unfinished ideas like sketches or paper prototypes in front of customers to assess desirability before committing to a next level of fidelity. And the tools like Axure, Balsamiq, and Vision, and even just good old-fashioned HTML support them in that. And then that combines with rapid testing tools to quickly put these prototypes in front of customers and really test them out before calling them final. So tools like user testing are in a category we call remote unmoderated usability testing, which in particular speeds up the testing process because it gives direct access to large numbers of people to test with on really short notice. Tools like Optimizely are also really good for A/B testing or comparing two or more designs where only very specific variables are different to determine which of those variables work best. Silverback is a desktop version for in-person research, and similar to user testing and other tools in this category, it records not just the user's screen, but also the user's voice and the user's face, and you can really see that emotional reaction, the moments of confusion, that puzzled grimace, the furrowed brow. All of these become really important nonverbal data points that help you understand how customers perceive an experience and that speak volumes to the organization when you're trying to report this data back out. Finally, not only do modern UX teams think about upfront research and analysis and prototyping and validation, but they also embed and partner deeply with their cross-functional peers to ensure quality execution. And I don't know if it's by coincidence or by design, but what I found in my research is that where you find a modern UX organization, you're also more likely to find a company that does Agile. So a lot of modern UX teams, and even some of the progressing ones, talked in my research quite a bit about how they integrate with Agile. So Agile integration tools become pretty important. But what's interesting is I think there are fewer established tools right now to support that Agile UX integration. So we find teams who are sort of just experimenting to make that happen. So I saw some teams who are using Trello, which is sort of a multi-purpose tool for organizing information to organize kind of the backlog and the user stories. Similarly, I see teams using FeatureMap, which kind of helps teams collaborate online around lists and tasks, and they're using it in the same way. And then UX 360 is another example of a tool that integrates with Agile development platforms to kind of make that connection between UX and Agile. So there you have it, a complete UX toolkit for the modern UX team with nary a mention of the Adobe Creative Suite, although that's kind of important too. So if you look across these tools, what's interesting, I think, is that it's still really a collection of point solutions in a lot of ways, and in many cases they've been developed just by the people who most need them. Like Smaply was created by Mark Stickdorn, who's a service designer, and Journey's app was created by Universal Mind, which is an agency. I think what we'll see is that tools in the future might start to bring some of these elements together to make a more kind of complete UX kind of enterprise-wide offering. But I think one example of a tool that's attempting that platform approach already is Tandem 7's own UX 360, which we talked about a bit through this. So just as an example of kind of what the platform approach would and will, I think, in the future bring together. You see with UX 360, so number one, there's deep research data that's in here, and that's available both in kind of unstructured format. It's a little hard to see, but there's a little narrative data tab on the top left, so you can get into those stories and that qualitative data. But then the tool supports seeing that data in a structured way, increasingly blending kind of statistical data with sort of more narrative data. And then in the UX process, data ultimately should turn into personas. And since the platform contains the underlying research data, it's kind of a short step to bring some of that underlying data into the persona to kind of give the persona quantitative rigor. So like in this particular example, from UX 360, the persona kind of model includes an indication of the frequency of response from the affinity group across certain categories. You can see how much the persona sort of aligns to evidence from the research. And then user research and personas, of course, feed into journey maps that contain emotion lines, but they also, in the case here, they contain references to KPIs for the organization. So it's really easy to start to think, okay, these are the low points on the journey line. Those potentially are opportunities to improve key KPIs, and then to think about what the user stories for the product backlog might be for that. And then, again, in this kind of more platform approach, you can then plug right into the Agile backlog management software. So that's just one example, I think, that illustrates the level of throughput that modern UX teams are exhibiting kind of with respect to the overall UX process. And that's whether it's in a tool like this or even just a kind of host of tools. The key is teams are thinking kind of that broadly about their work. So that was a whirlwind. I'm going to close with a few thoughts on kind of where to go next. If you feel like you're almost there and you want to get closer, or if you feel like you want to be more of a modern UX team. So first and foremost, I think, is assessing the scope of what your company is willing to put UX on, what they think UX sort of applies to. If UX is just for the website right now, I think the challenge is how can you start to get more involved in kind of customer journey mapping and sort of broad assessment around the overall customer journey to identify how the touch points can work together to create a more holistic experience. Secondly, audit the process. Are you guys just doing design and testing today? And if so, is there room for more research and strategy in that process? And where are there kind of clear examples where a lack of customer understanding and customer research led to maybe an uninformed strategy that once designed, the market corrected, essentially. Number three, I think once you have some of these key pieces in place, it's really important to kind of identify what tools are necessary for your organization to make sure that you're not losing the data that you're gathering for customer understanding, to make sure that you're enabling an iterative design process that helps you kind of get the design right before it's out there in the world, and then how are you able to kind of share this information across the organization to foster better understanding about customers and a greater culture of customer centricity. And then kind of a last tip, kind of a good thumb in the wind indicator is just how well is UX staffed today to do this work? Are there enough people to do the kind of work that your organization has ambitions for from a UX perspective? And do you have leaders who are kind of high enough in terms of stature to help settle some difficult negotiations when it becomes necessary? I ask the question here, what's your ratio? Because I've been finding and hearing that looking at the ratio of designers to developers is one really good thumb in the wind indicator of whether you are well set up for UX. In John Maida's recent presentation at South by Southwest, he reinforced a number that I kind of came to independently in my own research, which is that 1 to 4, 1 designer to 4 developers is really an optimal ratio for John says for startups, but I think for very experience-focused organizations. But I've seen other research that suggests you shouldn't ever really get much less than like 1 to 12 designers to developers. So some numbers to think about. So with that, we've got some time left for questions. I'm going to turn to Q&A at this point. And yeah, thanks for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. Like you said, at this point, we're going to do a few minutes of Q&A. As a reminder, if you're interested in asking Leah a question about today's topic, please submit through the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll address it in the order it was received. If we don't have time to address your question today, we'll do our best to follow up with you individually.
Okay, and I'm reading through the questions right now, so just give me a moment to kind of digest. So here's a question. So in what team would a UX designer be put on? Where would a UX designer sit? And would they be working with a dev team or in a team parallel to the dev team? How close would that UX person work with architects and product managers? And this is from Roger Straub. Thank you, Roger, for the question. What I'm seeing is that it's in the modern sort of UX organization model, it's both both very embedded and also separate, paradoxically. So I mentioned this sort of briefly, but I'll explain it a little more. I think it's common, I think, to see more of a kind of hub and spoke model in modern UX organizations, where there are absolutely UX teams who are really working in a team model with product managers, program managers, developers, enterprise architects. I mean, the key is UX quality. Really, in terms of kind of the fine details, is better when there is actually sort of a UX person who's sort of shoulder to shoulder and head to head with developers. So it tends to be better both from a product perspective and in a way from a UX team morale perspective when UX is as close as possible to that cross-functional team. I've seen some agile organizations where UX sort of sits outside of the scrum, and it sort of works a couple sprints ahead, and it can lead to a sense of separation between those teams, and that there seems to be greater success in terms of the product, but also greater kind of satisfaction for all parties when it feels like UX has skin in the game and is a part of that team. That said, if that's the only model that you have, there's a risk that UX becomes sort of too much a manager of pixels in a way with the engineering partners, and becomes too focused on sort of delivering sprint by sprint to actually think more broadly about broader experience strategy and some of that upfront research. So it's common, I think, to see then maybe a separate set of skills, separate set of employees on the UX team who are doing more of the upfront research, or who are actually doing what we call UX strategy, to sort of set that higher level sort of vision for where the experience is headed. Or it's even common to find, if you have a very agile-centric organization, teams who embed with their cross-functional colleagues sprint by sprint, but then take a breather periodically to reset strategy and to do the research that they need to do. So it's not a simple answer to your question, but the answer is both as close as possible to the product teams, and then also with a little bit of distance at key points in the process. There is a question from Jay Purdue about UX 360's capabilities compared to Confluence, and I don't have enough information about Confluence to answer that, but I think maybe we can take that as a takeaway to follow up with you on that one, if that's okay. Let's see. Are there industries where modern UX has become the norm? It's a great question. Yeah, so interestingly, I find, so certainly tech. I mean, a lot of my research kind of comes out of, you know, the Googles and the Facebooks and sort of the other big technology firms here in Silicon Valley. And I think it's easier in a way for UX to have that success because many of these companies are sort of born digital, and the idea that user experience is sort of central to everything that the company provides is sort of less of a barrier than if you're coming out of a more established industry that has a longer history, that, you know, where they're coming kind of later to the game on software. That said, I think industries that are feeling the heat of disruption are embracing the kind of modern UX model more aggressively than others, and the prime example for that is financial services. There's so much interesting innovation going on around kind of payments and lending and insurance and banking, and a lot of pressure both coming from the way that regulations are changing in the financial services industry and the way that technology is lowering barriers to pretty tightly governed industries, that I think it's making financial services firms realize they need to have more robust user experience capabilities. And so I've talked to a number of modern UX firms that are either already operating on this model or who are actively figuring out how to start to organize on this model. So I think we'll see more of that. I think also in retail, it's common to find this model a little bit more, because particularly retailers who've already been thinking for a long time about kind of the relationship between, you know, e-tail and sort of physical retail have realized that digital is something that pervades the customer experience for them. So they've been more aggressive in chasing kind of UX function, I would say. Okay, let's see. Next question. How would you define UX, and where does it sit in the companies you interviewed? By Sabina Karkin. That's a great question. in about a month, I will be having another webinar with Tandem 7, which is called Bridging the CX-UX Divide. And in that one, I actually go into more detail about how I define UX. So attend that one if you can. But the other to answer your question at a high level, what I would say is I think of UX as really essentially a core set of capabilities that are about customer user research, essentially, activities, and design activities, and then the necessary strategy in relationship to that. And in terms of where it sits in the organization, I think the answer to that really depends. It depends company by company. It depends industry by industry. It's really common to find UX that sits in a technology organization, and that's not bad necessarily. I think what that's doing is actually helping technology organizations show their relevance to business. I mean, they do in other ways as well, but I think I think customer experience is something that businesses are increasingly interested in, and UX is obviously a core component of that. The downside of UX being embedded in technology is it makes UX sort of digital only by definition. I also see UX teams that are more aligned with sort of marketing, but then the risk with that is that the UX teams they're more applied to marketing initiatives exclusively, which means there isn't necessarily as much of the UX love given to the kind of core product or core service experience. According to my research, in 13% of firms, CX and UX are actually aligned and may sit alone as a kind of their own function. And I think that's probably where we're going to see more headed, because I think customer experience as a discipline has done a great job of getting the organization to empower them and challenge them to think across the customer journey holistically. And then the question becomes, how can they leverage UX design and UX research skills to not just sort of figure out what needs to be done across the customer experience, but also to design to that customer experience. So we'll probably see more in that area. I am looking at the time, and I think that was probably, sadly, the last question we have time for. But I want to thank you all again for joining for the webinar today. I'm happy, I'll advance to my last slide, which is contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to chat further. And thanks again for joining today. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Allison.
Great questions, everyone. As Leah said, we are at the top of the hour, so we'll have to end. Tandem 7 would like to thank you all for participating today, and a very big thank you to Leah, of course, for sharing her time and expertise. As mentioned earlier, we will be following up with those of you who we couldn't get to, and everyone who joined today's presentation will be receiving a complimentary copy of Leah's latest Forrester report, How to Modernize User Experience. Once again, we hope you enjoyed today's Tandem 7 webinar, and thank you for attending, and have a great afternoon.